Chaska had one of the longest-running brickyards in the state of Minnesota. This video focuses in on the years 1857 to 1865. Settlement in the nation's midsection continued in the 1850s, with the river system acting like interstate highways. New settlers followed the Ohio River to St. Louis, where they could find transportation northward along the Mississippi River. The larger ports along the Mississippi River were Fulton, Illinois, Galena, Illinois, Dunleith, Illinois, Dubuque, Iowa, Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, and La Crosse, Wisconsin. In 1857, Minnesota was still a territory, but several counties had taken shape west of Minneapolis and St. Paul. One of those counties was Carver County, which was located along the Minnesota River. This map shows the Mississippi River, which flows from northwest to southeast, as well as the Minnesota River, which flows to the east-northeast, and the early towns along the Minnesota River. The Mississippi River was wider than the Minnesota River, but the levels in both rivers fluctuated between drought and flood. Shakopee was the first town upriver, followed by Chaska, Carver, Jordan, and Belle Plaine. Steamboats were the quickest means of travel in those days. For those traveling over land, there were very few roads initially. To get across the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, ferry boats were used. Steamboats varied in size, but some of the largest ones could carry around 500 people. The ferries, like the one at Fort Snelling, could carry several wagons and teams. Shakopee was a settlement that adjoined a Native American Sioux village, and it was named after one of their chiefs. Initially, the Native American population interspersed with the new settlers without much conflict. The Minnesota River Valley has bluffs on both sides of the river, which generally extend 100 to 250 feet above the elevation of the valley floor. The width of the valley typically varies from half a mile wide to 1 mile wide. The bottomlands of the valley are usually overflowed when the river floods. To get another look at the topography of the Minnesota River Valley, let's take a look at two old pictures from near Fort Snelling. The first was drawn from the Mendota side of the Minnesota River, looking toward Fort Snelling. It is easy to see why the fort was such a good site, as it sits on top of the river bluff, giving it a commanding view of both the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. The second view is from the bluffs across the Mississippi River from Fort Snelling, looking down toward the bluffs on the Minnesota River on the Mendota side. In this photo, there are 2 tiers of elevation change visible. You can also see how flat the Minnesota River Valley floor is. This is an early town site plat map of Chaska. Each square is a city block, and the green square in the middle represents the City Square Park. Although the Chaska town site was surveyed for planning purposes, this map makes Chaska look larger than it actually was. In 1856, Chaska had about 26 buildings. Of those buildings, 1 was a sawmill, 4 were stores, several were shops, and there was 1 hotel. The rest were houses. A majority of these buildings were initially located near the Minnesota River. The 1857 Minnesota census showed Chaska had 152 residents. Of those, the majority were from Germany. Of the remaining few, a good portion came from New England. Of the 152 residents, males outnumbered females by about 2 to 1. Of the 152 residents, most ranged in age from 20 to 40. This seems like fairly young people from our perspective, but in the 1850s, the average life expectancy was about 38 years. There were a few older residents, and also a good number of younger ones. By 1860, Chaska had grown to 552 residents. Again, most of these residents were from Germany. Although it had grown in population from 1857 to 1860, the percentage of German-born citizens remained about the same. Of the 552 residents in 1860, males still outnumbered females. However, the ratio was becoming closer. Of the 552 residents, many remained in the 20 to 40 age group. The big change that sticks out is the increase in the younger ages. The new residents were having children. Displaying the charts side by side makes it easy to see the growth in the younger residents. The start of brickmaking in Chaska was tied to one thing: establishing Chaska as the county seat of Carver County. This required a courthouse. So in 1857 this process began. County courthouses in those days tended to be architectural masterpieces. For the Carver County Courthouse, Burritt S. Judd was the architect, and Marvin White was a brick mason. Judd, who lived in Chanhassen, was also the architect of the new Minneapolis Episcopal Church. County courthouses also tended to be made of brick or stone. Lucius Howe made the brick, and the local newspaper said that about 575,000 brick composed the courthouse. 575,000 brick was a big order of brick, but if a person invested in a brickyard, he definitely wanted more business than that. As early as 1855, the settlers of the Minnesota Valley realized they were in a great position to sell their goods to the growing city of St. Paul. One resident of Carver, just upstream from Chaska, advertised in the St. Paul newspaper for a brickmaker. In the ad, the resident noted that Minnesota Valley brick could easily be boated down the Minnesota River to St. Paul to be sold. So in addition to a local market, Chaska Brick also had a much larger market in St. Paul. So what gave Chaska the ingredients to take advantage of this opportunity? It basically comes down to the law of supply and demand. Let's start by looking at some of the supply factors. These can be a bit confusing, so we will look at them one at a time. First, let's look at price of the goods. Brick were sold by the thousands, so a given price was per 1,000 brick. The first price shown for Chaska Brick was in 1865, when they were quoted at $12 per thousand. The Chaska newspaper said this price was very high. In addition, orders outside of Chaska had to add a transportation charge to this number. Let's look next at the cost of production. The cost of production was initially high due to startup costs, which covered a variety of things for a new brickyard. These included tables for the brickmaker, a harness and feed for the horses or mules, various hardware for the workers, operating expenses, which could include renting or buying the required land, and feeding and paying the workers, a tempering wheel, brick molds, making mixing pits, carts to haul clay, at least 4 wheelbarrows, and the 2 horses or mules. These expenses added up to about $1,000, which would be about $30,000 today. Not too many people in Chaska in 1857 could afford to spend that amount of money. Only ones who were fairly well off. The next item is natural conditions. In Minnesota, early outdoor brickyards could not manufacture brick year-round. It was strictly a warm season business. At Chaska, normal low temperatures rose above freezing around April 12th, and did not fall back below 33 degrees until around October 27th. So generally, brick could be made for about 6 months during the year. Other factors could cut into that 6-month timeline, like floods. The early brickyard locations were fairly close to the river, and were susceptible to the higher flood events. If their workspace was flooded, the brickyards could not produce brick. Then when the river dropped again, it left a silt layer over everything, which required more time to remove. Storms were also an enemy to brick manufacturers. After a wet brick was formed, it had to dry in the yard until it was hard. This could take a few days or a few weeks, depending on how warm and dry it was. During this period, the drying brick could not get wet or be struck by hail. Either of these would ruin drying brick. Frost was also an enemy of drying brick. If temperatures got cold enough for frost, that also destroyed the drying brick. Let's look next at technology. Again, remember this is technology during the 1857 to 1865 period. Making bricks was relatively simple and involved 6 things: mining the clay, weathering the clay, mixing the clay with sand and water, molding the bricks, drying the bricks, and firing the bricks. As for those 6 steps, the first step was mining the clay. In Chaska, the clay beds were covered in several feet of gravel, which had to be scraped off. Once that was done, the clay could be shoveled into carts, pulled by horses. Step 2 was weathering the clay. This meant that after the clay was mined, it was left out in the elements for a year. The freeze-thaw cycle helped break down the clay, so it would be easier to work with. For Minnesota brickmakers, this was generally done in the fall, before the ground froze solid. Step 3 was the blending step. The clay had to be mixed with sand and water. In this picture, horses walk in a circle, pulling the tempering wheel, which mixed the clay, sand, and water. To mold the bricks, the clay mixture was brought out of the pit to a man at a work table, like the one pictured on the left. This man pushed the clay mixture into wooden brick molds that could hold 1, 2, 3, or even more bricks. When the molding was done, the bricks were carried out into the brickyard to dry on the ground. Finally, step 6 was firing the bricks in a kiln. The bricks had to be picked up off the ground and carried into the kiln. Here they were carefully stacked into huge piles. However, there had to be space between each brick for hot air to flow. On the side of the stack, arches were built to house the wood fires. The kiln itself was a wooden shed. It had a wooden roof, wooden supports, and movable wooden planks to cover up the sides and keep the heat in. Depending on the weather, the fires were kept burning in the kiln for several days, which hardened the brick. This is a picture of a brickyard with all the components visible. The clay was mined in the lower right. The clay could be weathered in the same location it was dug. The horse walking in the circle mixed the clay, sand, and water. The brick molding table in this example was near the mixing point. The bricks were dried in the open air. Finally, the kiln generally looked like an old shed. This particular brickyard had 3 brick production areas going at the same time, which essentially tripled their capacity. The next category is transport conditions. During the 1857 to 1865 period, there were 2 ways to transport brick, by horsepower or by water power. During the warm season, horses pulled wagon loads of brick. A horse team could generally pull 750 to 1,000 brick per load. However, remember that the Minnesota River Valley had steep bluffs, so those totals were likely lower if the transport location was uphill. A large brick church required around 500,000 bricks. At 1,000 bricks per load, a large brick church required 500 wagon loads. That was a lot of back and forth, or expense. That is why members of the early churches typically hauled the brick themselves, so the congregation wouldn't have to pay the transport charges. Roads were a mix of dirt and gravel in those days, so wagon travel depended on the dryness of the roads. Heavy loads could not be transported on wet roads. The winter was another option. Horses could pull sleighs full of brick, as long as there was sufficient snow. Since the price of brick tended to be lower in the cold season, many people bought and transported the brick then, getting it ready to be laid when the weather warmed up in the spring. Finally, brick were transported on wooden barges on the Minnesota River. The barges were floated downstream to Shakopee and St. Paul to drop off their loads. Then they were pulled back upstream by steamboats. This started as early as 1859, as his Shakopee newspaper noted. Factor prices and their availability can be broken into 6 subcategories. Clay, the first item, was common at Chaska. When glaciers from the Ice Age melted thousands of years ago, they formed Lake Agassiz, portions of which covered the Red River Valley of the north. One of the outlets to Lake Agassiz was the glacial River Warren, which would later become the Minnesota River Valley. This process left several layers within the Minnesota River Valley. The top section was till, a sand, gravel, and boulder mix. Below that was yellow clay and blue clay. These layers of clay could vary from a few feet thick up to 40 or more feet thick. These different layers were not continuous, they were intermixed at times. The clay layers tended to be intermixed with sand. Sand was a necessary ingredient from our list in the lower left. So the Chaska brick makers had a ready supply of sand right there with their clay. The brick makers tended to prefer the blue clay, but all three ingredients could be mixed together. Water was an easy one. The Minnesota River was very close to the Chaska brickyards. Water could be pumped or carried where it was needed. Fuel was also plentiful, as Chaska was located in the Big Woods region of Minnesota. It typically required 1 quart of wood to burn 2,000 bricks in a kiln. Some of the early Chaska kilns contained 200,000 bricks. Just burning those 200,000 bricks required 200 cords of wood. However, trees were thick in the Big Woods region, and new residents had to clear stretches of trees to plant crops. Selling wood was a huge business, especially in the winter. Labor was also plentiful. Steamboats brought a constant stream of immigrants to Minnesota, and the Chaska town site was like an exit off the interstate. Plus, not all immigrants were cut out for life on the frontier. Some moved back to town and needed jobs. The final category was expertise. As the country expanded westward in the 1857 to 1865 period, men of all trades also expanded westward. Brickyards were located in nearly every town, so there was plenty of expertise available. Another supply factor was government policies. These could range from drafts during the Civil War period to tax policies as well. One early Chaska reference noted that residents were charged $3.60 for every $100 of property. Taxes and government policies varied from year to year and are pretty hard to track. Finally, supply depended on the prices of related goods. For early Chaska, structures were mainly built out of lumber. So lumber was the main competitor to brick. The first Chaska lumberyard didn't arrive until 1863. So Minneapolis, St. Anthony, and St. Paul were the main lumber suppliers. Lumber could be obtained at a high price by the steamboat trade, or farmers could drive all the way to Minneapolis, about 30 miles by wagon. Either way would be expensive. Basically all building material in early Chaska was expensive to obtain. The demand for Chaska brick came both locally and from St. Paul. Some demand factors are also supply factors. So we already established that the price of Chaska brick in the early 1860s was high. The income of buyers varied, but as this chart shows, there was a general decline in spending money on building construction in St. Paul during this period. Prices of related goods is also a supply factor, and we looked at this already as well. However, we didn't look at the basic geography of the region. Brick was first made in St. Paul in 1849. However, since it was becoming a larger town, real estate costs were higher than Chaska. Therefore, it was more profitable to build homes and businesses in St. Paul rather than brickyards. Brick manufacturing began in Minneapolis in 1854. However, the best clay beds were north of town, and St. Anthony Falls was a barrier to barge traffic from these brickyards to St. Paul. Shakopee also commenced brick manufacturing in 1854. However, the Shakopee area had rich limestone deposits. Lime and bricks did not mix. Carver began to manufacture brick in 1859, but it was further upstream of Chaska. Bricks were also made at Jordan and Belle Plaine, but the Carver Rapids, large boulders in the Minnesota River, prevented heavy barge loads from passing during periods of low river levels. Bricks were also made at Hastings, but that was downstream from St. Paul. So Chaska had a very good setup. Another demand factor was the tastes or preferences of consumers. Other than brick, early St. Paul houses and buildings were built of local blue limestone and wood. St. Paul had several quarries in town, and citizens generally favored local building products over imported ones. Many of the early St. Paul business blocks were built of the local blue limestone. However, wood was typically the cheapest building material, but also the most flammable. Defective chimney flues started many fires, which easily spread. Finally, consumer expectations also affected demand. There was an economic downturn in 1857, known as the Panic of 1857. In St. Paul, land values had shot up way more than they were worth. When the bubble burst, many people lost all they had. The Civil War began in 1861, and Minnesota sent 1/7 of its population to fight in the war. Families were broken up, and there were fewer people to spend money or work. The Indian Uprising also occurred in 1862, leading to more panic and economic downturn. Finally, natural disasters like river flooding or drought also affected consumer expectations. In concluding, let's take a look at several year-by-year statistics from 1857 to 1865, starting with the brickyard owners. Lucius Howe operated the first brickyard in 1857, but took several years off before starting again. John W. Gregg operated a brickyard in Chaska throughout the entire time frame. The numbers in red are the number of men who worked in each brickyard. The 1857 Minnesota census showed Howe employed 13 men, and the 1860 United States Census showed Gregg employed 12 men. Initially, the Chaska brickmakers did not do much advertising. This is the first ad for Chaska Brick in the local newspaper. All the Chaska brickyards were located in close proximity during the 1857 to 65 period on the southeast edge of town. Now let's take a look at population trends. This information is taken from census records in 1857, 1860, and 1865. Other sources may give slightly different numbers. The population of Chaska is shown by the numbers above the green columns. These show that the population of Chaska grew during this time period, although by no means was it a large town. The populations of St. Paul and Minneapolis can be inferred by the scale on the left. St. Paul is the red line, and it showed slow growth to around 13,000 people by 1865. Minneapolis, the blue line, also showed slow growth to around 5,000 people by 1865. Next, let's look at some brickyard statistics. The number of Chaska brickyards is shown by the number above the cream-colored boxes. As an example, there were 2 brickyards in 1865. The scale for the number of bricks produced during the year is shown on the left. Essentially, this number remained around 500,000 during the 1857 to 1865 time frame. Remember, there was an economic panic in 1857, which lasted for several years. The Civil War was also a big factor in brick production during this time frame. So where was Chaska brick made during this time frame used? We have already mentioned that in 1857 most of the brick went into the Carver County Courthouse in Chaska. Chaska brick was also used to make the Moravian Church in Chaska, as well as a number of other smaller houses and businesses in town. In Shakopee, Chaska brick was used in St. Mary's Church. Also at Shakopee, Chaska brick was used in St. Mark's Church. Chaska brick was used in the new jail at Fort Snelling. Chaska brick also went to St. Paul, where it was likely used in chimneys and various small projects. That concludes the video. Please check out my websites at mnbricks.com and chaskabrick.com.